So we're moving away from the late Renaissance and we're coming into Mannerism. This is still happening in Italy, and it's going to transition into ending the Renaissance, going into Baroque. The characteristics of mannerisms is we're going to see these elongated twisting figures. It's going to have careful detail, and it's going to have a tendency to manipulate the anatomy. So it's going to be quite strange. The visual effect with unusual colors, over-exaggerated expressions, odd arrangement, bizarre scenes. It's just going to be strange. It rejected the calm and the balance that we've been seeing in the Renaissance. So Mannerism was the art movement that took place immediately after the Renaissance during the 16th century. It was an interesting time for art. Michelangelo, Da Vinci, and many other Renaissance artists had filled Europe with this incredible classical works of art that no doubt intimidated as much as inspired the artists to come after them. So if we look closely at some of the figures of Michelangelo, even in some of the paintings by Raphael, we notice some characteristics that do not fit in what we know about the Renaissance style. We could say that Michelangelo and Raphael both show signs of moving past the style of the Renaissance into a new style that we call Mannerism. The first is this elongation of the neck and torso, sometimes strangely fluid arms and legs in portraits or figurative paintings. This is because in Mannerism, the real-life accuracy of painting wasn't as important anymore. Instead, artists were more interested in creating interesting composition and expressing emotion. So, pretty much they've already achieved the greatness. Michelangelo, Da Vinci, how do you surpass them? You really can't. So what can you do is turn the movement into something else. So we're going to focus on the expression of an emotion. That meant if a piece called for a figure's arm to be unequal or really, really long, then so be it. It's one of the ways the Mannerists could distinguish themselves from the more traditional artists who came before them. The Reformation will go on, and Martin Luther had been stirring things up in Germany. The spread of his radical preachings was causing many to question the authority of the church. And the church, they found this absolutely intolerable. In response to the Reformation was to launch the Counter-Reformation, a joyless, restrictive, authoritative movement which had a zero-tolerance policy towards Renaissance innovations, among many, many other things. So here was poor art deprived of the most of its genius, patrons, and freedom. If Mannerism seems a bit behind to us now, it was honestly about the best that could be expected under the circumstances. So Michelangelo made the transition to Mannerism with great ease, as we saw in the Last Judgment with the figures and the colors. And he was already kind of doing this style. The second element sometimes seen in Mannerism is symbolism. So Mannerist artists would use visual allegories and complex meanings in order to appeal to a specific wealthier audience instead of making art for everyone. Parmigianino painting that we're looking at now was intended for the wealthy class. It exemplifies the elongation of the Mannerists gave their figures, so much so that the painting is actually called Madonna with the long neck. So it's very Mannerist, tall, about 7 feet, and look at her. She has this tiny, tiny head, wide hips, large legs, and tiny toes. Distorted anatomy. Her body almost makes this diamond composition with about her, and it's an elongated, large, contorted body of Christ on her lap, almost foreshadowing the moment of his death to come, if you remember the Pietà of Michelangelo's piece. So he looks almost dead, but he's sleeping. And how do you beat the Renaissance? You really can't. You have to do something. And so this is extreme, exaggerated in its art taken from art. The Renaissance reflects natural and the nature. So there's needed to be a shift to something different. So these impossibly long fingers softly touching her chest for drama. We see the impossible versus the perfection of the Renaissance. So this is painted when he was about 21 years old, and he's showing off. This is his bragging rights. He's bragging about how good he is. It's a self-portrait, but it's distorted and fun. It's distorted from the convex mirror. He mimics the mirror, calm face, but the distortion of the environment in the background is swirling about him. Early Mannerism uses distortion. It's to say, hey, look what I can do. And the doorway in the background shows the death, a sense of going back into space. So this is really bragging rights for him, and he does this very, very well. He was really good at this. This is Pontormo's Entombment of Christ, early Mannerist style. The landscape and architecture, gone. It's replaced with this complex composition of figures. Look at the odd coloring of the skin tone. There's no pyramid composition, but there's these twisting figures that are elongated, unnatural, legs shorter. This overwrought Mary with this, it's just so strange, everything about it. This is the first taste of the Mannerist style that emphasized dynamic complexity over naturalistic representation. It shows tension and stability, distortion of the figures, and flattening of the space. Now look at this man in the front. He has this odd pink coloring skin, and his legs are way too short to support him if he was to stand up straight. Now, we've looked at A Last Supper before by Da Vinci, and we're going to revisit that theme with Tintoreto's enormous painting, 12 feet by 19 feet. Its powerful death, dramatic angles. It includes these unaware, disconnected servants and pets. So we see some figures not really interacting or even aware of these angels overhead. The disciples seem to notice them. Christ is almost like a bridge to allow them to see the angels, or the ghosts, if you will, swooping down. The man on opposite side of the table is probably suggested to be Judas, and even Jesus has his back to him. And notice, he is the only one at the table without a halo. And we do know the story behind him. He is the one that indeed betrays Jesus. Two sources of light, a lantern, which could symbolize God's engulfing light, and the divine light from the halos. A lot of movement and death. Not a private event, but almost like if we was to go to a restaurant with a lot of people, as opposed to Da Vinci's very private table. So we're looking at Veronesia, Christ in the House of Levi. This is a massive painting, 30 feet, known chiefly for the religious feast scenes. It was supposed to be a Last Supper, but the title got changed. And here's where the controversy comes from. The Last Supper kind of got lost. It's pushed back by all the figures celebrating and moving about, engaged in actions of real people. So if you took a picture, this is what it would look like. You just stopped time. And this is what he loved to paint, figures in a situation of a composition. The Counter-Reformation was key to pushing the religious beliefs using arts, and this was not welcomed. He was put on trial for painting this and was called before the court. So the early church was appalled by it. They questioned him, questioned the meaning of different aspects of it, like, why was there a jester in there? Why is this man picking his teeth with a fork? Why are there buffoons in the painting? Where's the decorum? So he replied that he was told to paint it as he saw fit, and he did just that. They debated over it until he finally decided to change the title of the painting, which satisfied the church. Um, so he just didn't back down. He defended his work, and he spoke with authority about his talent, and he took up for what he thought was right. Correggio's assumption of the version. This is what was known as frog leg stew. A vortex of fluttering drapery and naked limbs rose above him as Mary is lifted up. Now, he did not get the credit he deserved for this piece, but there is a sense of the eye trying to sort through all these limbs with this extreme foreshortening. So this massive figures on figures with a complex composition, it kind of gets lost on your eye. It's hard to read, and there's no way to focus. And so he didn't really get the credit that he probably deserved for this beautiful painting. He also painted this Jupiter and Io. It's a mythical painting, the story of Hera, Zeus's wife, who was, jealous because he fooled around. He was a womanizer, and Zeus would transform himself to hide his unfaithful acts, his affairs. Here he is, a cloud in bright daylight, embracing this beautiful nymph. You can see his face kind of in the cloud. It's a vertical composition, sensuous, mouth opening, head tilted back, arms wrapping around the smoky cloud. She is welcoming him. The main qualities are that it's a bit shocking in terms of subject matter. Often, although the themes are classical, this one was depicted as a little bit too sexy. However, it's shocking, risque. Mannerist artists still seem to know the basic rules and were able to get away with staying inside the boundaries of good taste. So, he's still using some type of etiquette and manners, but he's also bending the rules a bit. He paints this fantastic illusion in such a believable manner that we think this cloud, which is Zeus in disguise, is rendered in such a believable way that, this is really him, a real figure. And the anatomy is distorted on her, but it's so beautiful that we don't even notice this. Her head is a bit too small, the torso is elongated, but at first glance it seems believable. And the pose is somewhat improbable, but again, looks real as you read the overall painting. The space he creates is also a twist on earlier depiction of space. Here he forgoes the illusion of depth of space and pushes the whole scene up against the picture plane. And the space around it is strange. The viewer, after closer look of the painting, is forced to ask themselves, where exactly is this taking place? We're looking at Signorelli's Punishment of the Damned. It's kind of happening here in three parts. Viewed all together, this huge fresco in this chapel gives an impression of overcrowding and confusion, which is far from pleasing. We have to isolate the individual details in order to grasp the greatness of it. It is full of humor, grotesque inventions, erotic allusions, and vulgar jokes with imagery of characters and devils. The scene of the damned is constructed around the visionary, almost surrealistic idea of these crowds of naked figures jostling for space along the banks of this place. It is a representation at the foot of two big mountains along the shores. A devil with a white banner leads the group of the damned. Other damned are in despair since they see the boat getting near. They are punishing these men. Above, two angels, one wearing a breastplate, the other covered with veils, are watching the scene. It's bizarre, it's odd, and look at the unnatural colors. It just all is very distinct to the Mannerist style. We're moving over to Mannerism in the Northern Europe and Spain area. And the first one we're going to look at is Matthias Grunewald, his Altarpiece. The center is about 10 feet. The dark background with the light hitting the form creates this chiaroscuro. It was made for a hospital chapel, which specialized in skin disease. So it's fitting, being this grotesque in color, and these wounds are horrific. So Mary is pleading, hands grasping, grieving over her child, and the beautiful weightlessness of Christ, who will once again rise after the crucifixion. We're looking at it opened up now. Very beautiful. Okay, so we have to talk about Dürer. This is his self-portrait. His work is primarily high Renaissance to late, but he also has some mannerisms in there. He's referred to as the German Leonardo da Vinci in his complex compositions with illogical compression of space, the elongated proportions and exaggerated autonomy of the figures pretty much gives his a manneristic style. So here's a self-portrait. It's relatively small, almost Christ-like, full frontal, which is reserved for Christ back in that day. So he's shown himself very powerful. He was a humanist, interested in the way of science and how art worked together. He was a writer as well and into philosophy. This is highly detailed. He goes out, he travels over the Alps to Italy, so he's bringing all this knowledge back to Germany. He is a very important artist and begins writing books, and he's only about 28 years old here. The focus is on the eyes and the hands that are the tools of the artist. And notice that there's really the odd placement of those fingers. It really makes this a manneristic painting. We're going to look at his Night, Death, and Devil, and when we looked at this, or we talked about this in a previous lecture of him using the devil. So it depicts this violent knight on horseback in front of a deceased knight and a grinning devil. The devil is to the right of the image, reaches out to the knight, calling to him. So there's temptation, this temptation of immoral behavior, the secular desires that are represented here by this devil. The beast look towards the knight, and the knight just ignores the beast behind him and continues on. So it's kind of like a moral lesson saying, don't give in to temptation. His look is calm and composed, his posture straight and upright. His armor is brilliant and without fault. He carries his lance in a passive manner, which suggests he may be peaceful, yet confident and content. The man does not divert his eyes from his goal. He keeps his head up. The knight would represent someone who's presented with corruption and temptation, but being brave in facing that temptation, moves past it and says no to it. The knight's steed is proudly trotting forward in all its muscular glory. This could be seen as representing the nobility and the strength. Keeping pace with the knight and his horse is this very cheerful looking dog, and dogs are used in Renaissance artwork as iconography for being watchful and loyal. The dog could be interpreted as the knight will stay loyal to his cause and his moral beliefs. And the left of the image is his corpse of a former knight with an hourglass in his hand and his ailing horse with a skull underfoot. Artists of this time period often use skulls in their painting. The hourglass can be interpreted two ways. The first is that the corpse time has run out, and the result is his immoral behavior. So that could be one. The second meaning could be a reminder that to the brave knight that he is mortal, so to use his time wisely. In the background is a beautiful castle that sits high atop a hill. It is quite possible that this castle could be interpreted as the kingdom of heaven. And Dürer was wonderful at doing these types of print. And let's look at Dürer's Fallen Man. Here is his rendition of the narrative. Look at the elongated muscular bodies and the almost symmetrical in stance, but very beautiful. He's also well known for Melancholia 1. It Actually, the title means black bough. So it's not referencing depression, but a sense of wellness. It connected to artists and writers. This winged female, melancholy, brooding figure posed in attitude of dejection and frustration with a sad, leaden, downward cast eyes. She's seated in this kind of temporary defeat with her head resting on her hand. She's surrounded by this clutter of tools of measurement, hourglass, compass, and scales. We're looking at Durer's Four Apostles. It's a diptych, 7 feet, the Protestant Reformation, and Durer converts from the follower of the Pope in the Catholic Church to Martin Luther. So the Bible is now available, thanks to Gutenberg's press, to many people, and Luther is translating it to spread the word. It was used only by priests and church officials, and they were the only ones allowed to read the Bible. But now, many people are able to read it, even if they're just peasants. The two faves of Martin Luther are in front, John and Paul. Paul is actually killed by a sword and holding the book which he wrote, the letters of Paul. We see the Catholics' favorites, who are Peter, the old man, and Mark with the scroll in the back. Powerful and individual men. This one is by Pieter Bruegel. It's The Blind Leading the Blind. And I absolutely love this painting. Now, Jesus told his disciples, it's, about this parable of the scribes and the Pharisees who heard about washing hands before eating. And it infuriated them. It was a clear breach of the Jewish law not to, wash the hands. So when the disciples informed Jesus about that, he replied that if the Pharisees were the blind leading the blind, all of them would end up falling into a ditch, and the disciples should pay no attention to them. So he depicts this subject literally. Here, the painting is a study of different stages of falling. So a technical challenge that Bruegel seemed to be fascinated by toward the end of his life. The expression on the faces ranged from trust to surprise to even shock. The church in the background emphasized his message: do not blindly follow leaders that lead you away from the church, and you will end up in trouble. So this was a message. I like to use this message as, just because someone tells you something, you need to go ahead and research it and make sure it's true, and just not take people's word for it. So this could be interpreted and applied to life today. So he usually painted details with great care after studying the subject extensively. And eye doctors are said to be able to recognize 5 different eye diseases in this painting. How amazing is that? That's unreal. Everything that we know in art history. It's just amazing. This is his peasant wedding. I love this. He's known as the peasant painter, and this peasant wedding featuring a wedding party is classified as a genre painting, which means everyday painting. The people crowded in the room with piles of hay. The Protestant Reformation caused artists in Northern Europe to seek new patrons and new subjects, so people buying art for the church has disappeared. So landscapes and genres and still lifes pop up for these wealthy, culture-based on trade and manufacturing, making significant money, saying, paint our world. So it feels monumental. There's a warm roughness to it, solid people, a simpler life of drinking and socializing. Trays being carried in with pudding, passing the food down the table. Our eyes are being drawn to the bride in front of the green cloth, almost creating a pyramid of bride and the 2 waiters. She doesn't speak. She isn't dressed in jewels. She is demure. There is a sense of humanity. People we would know, everyone happy and talking, and then the bagpipes are playing. A wonderful sense of time period of a wedding day. Isn't this amazing? Hunters in the Snow. Just look at this. You feel the code. It was made for a merchant to study the changing seasons of the months back in the medieval period. In his typical peasant genre with landscape scenes, Hunters in the Snow is one of the series of 6, and only 5 are surviving, and depicting different seasons of the year. The scene is one of these weary hunters with drooping shoulders, hunters returning with their dogs from an unsuccessful hunt. The diagonal line of the bare polar or elm trees move the viewer's eyes to the right, to the edge of the foreground steep hill. These repeated brown houses, behind them gray bare woods. They kind of it just all just reads frozen, chilly, icy, harsh times. Scientists had used his portrayal of this wintry scene to corroborate evidence on the severity of the Little Ice Age, during which the painting was created. Now that's really, really cool. We see a sense of maybe this little rabbit hanging just off the back, this stress of winter, the sense of trudging with these footprints, melancholy with the hunchbacks, and then it transforms into this playful little winter. We see how people inhabited the day of winter's time. The women carrying firewood, kids are skating, people are falling on ice, concentrating on the human quality of everyday life. It's harsh by its elements, but warmed by the people. Also created during the time of religious revolution in the Netherlands, he gives us a secular illustration of what country life should look like. We're looking at El Greco, the burial. It's a tremendously large painting. It's divided into 2 sections, the heaven and the earth. According to the legend, the burial of the Count was a mystical event. It was during this time when St. Augustine and St. Stephen descended from the heavens and buried the noble Count by their own hands. This magnificent event dazzled and amazed the eyes of all those who were present. In the heavens, the cloud appeared to have parted, so it was received this noble man into paradise. It also featured Christ, who was dressed in brilliantly white robe. He also served as the central point of a triangular composition that formed by the heavenly figures, including St. John the Baptist and the Madonna. Surrounding these 3 images of heavenly glory are martyrs, apostles, biblical kings, Philip II of Spain, who was still alive during this time. So they're vested in reds and golden robes, bending over the Count's body, showing reverence to this man. The artist is featured as one of the mourners in the artwork. And lastly, the people wearing this contemporary style dress in the era that depicted the prominent and elite members. It's exquisite, chromatic harmony. It's radiant, rich, and expressive, but it is odd and has elongated bodies that are arranged in these complex manners with colors that are a little off-putting. And who is the king of off-putting but Harmonious Bosch? He appeals to our interest of our dreams, and not a lot is known about this artist. He was most noted for the Garden of Earthly Delights, and we're looking at this closed, and when you open it up, you see all kinds of strange things. So just think, coming into a room and this huge triptych opening up to this wild and crazy images. It's almost demonic, repulsive, but you can't look away, kind of like a bad accident. So he reworked the way of thinking for that time. Owls were negative and suggested alarm. Unlike today, it means being wise. So these are filled with warnings. The owls watching and seeing the sin of the people. So much symbolism is unknown because it's based on a lost sayings of that time period. Good and evil, religion and ordinary and supernatural, serene and sinister. He's painted in his studio located at his house overlooking the market square. And maybe he picks up on this sense of mad satanic kind of crowds. But he was very religious and a member of a brotherhood that led to a lot of clients. So this painting is very religious. It's a warning of the dangers of society and to not be given into temptation, because if you're on earth and you partake in the earthly delights, well, you're going to pay for it later in hell. So make sure you're on the right path. And that was his message here. Anyone viewing this would come away with his or her own interpretation of this work, but that's in a sense what most art historians would agree on. And his style is so unique. The representation is so original. He's very creative, and it simply leaves you dazzled. For the past 5 centuries, people have tried to unlock the significance behind his aesthetic symbolism. And unlike his contemporaries, Leonardo da Vinci and Durer, Bosch left no letters, diaries, or writings of his own. His paintings are not even dated. So nearly everything known about him is actually guesswork by art historians and scholars. And they interpret this. These paintings, they're showing the shame and the sinfulness of mankind. So let's look at the first one. The first panel is the Garden of Eden. The Lord introduces newly creative Eve to the viewers in the left panel. It's airy, it has vastness about it, animal field, exotic creatures, hybrid monsters, but it's still odd with these sinister rock formations. Now look at the center. It's overpopulated with nude men and women. It's like a parade around a basin of different types of beasts. Birds, fruits, flowers, marine animals are symbols of the delights in sex. So it's also symbolizing the original sin of Adam and Eve, which dooms us to our desires with no hint of salvation. And the last panel is showing us hell, this nightmare scene, burning ruins, fantastic instruments of torture. It's very dark. You really need to get in here and just pick these apart to look at these weirdly weird scenes. But Bosch couldn't have created such an inventive painting without the help of the Medici family. The house of the Medici was a political dynasty, a banking family, and later a royal house. They were powerful and influential and didn't need the church's money or support. The family started the first art school, and they were the ones that allowed humanism to flourish. With the family allowing Botticelli to go away from Christian art, Bosch is able to portray humans with a Christian theme of being good, but never to this extent.